Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third of the webinar series. Good morning, good afternoon to the rest of the world. As ever, and this is maybe like a broken record over the last 3 days, I'm looking down the list of where people have come from or dialing in at the moment. We've got Japan, we've got Spain, we've got Lebanon, we've got Austria, we've got Nigeria, Estonia, we've got the States. It's just a wonderful energy to have, looking at who we have with us and just being together. This would have been the third day of our conference, original conference dates in Lyon. And normally this day is dedicated to the world of performance, and performance in terms of the culture and the skills needed to work in professional sport, and also how the team works together, both the physiotherapy team, the strength and conditioning team, the medical team, but also the coaching team. So I will speak today on some of those topics and try and draw through a little bit of the work that we've done as the Football Research Group and with Isokinetic, but also we'll have the opportunity with Matthew Buckthorpe and Francesco Della Villa to speak to some of the other topics that we had on Saturday and Sunday. It's also a great pleasure to have Amy Arundel with us. Many of you will know her or know of her. She's currently dialing in from a storage room in Industrial City in Brooklyn, where she works with the Brooklyn Nets in the NBA as a movement and performance physiotherapist. But also, many of you will also know her as her very acclaimed and well-published researcher. And some of you may also know about her being an international Aussie rules player as well. So Amy will host the question and answer sessions after I've finished speaking. And if you want to place a question to me or a question to Matthew or to Francesco, please just use the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And also a reminder to everybody that we're recording these sessions and we will put them out probably on a YouTube channel later in this week. And also where we can, we'll provide some certificates of attendance. So please bear with us on that. If you've got any questions after the session, just either send me a message or direct to Matthew or Francesco. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and we'll start with the presentation. So I guess one of the things that I'm most focused on at the moment is thinking about the next 2 years. We live in a world of uncertainty at the moment. We live in a time which everybody talks about being unprecedented. But I'm thinking forward, and I'm thinking forward 2 years. And 2 years from now, we'll be entering the early stages of the preparation for the World Cup in Qatar. And what I'm trying to do this evening is challenge you to think about what that might mean for you as an individual, what that might mean for the players that you work with, or what that might mean for you as a responsibility working with other people in this industry. But I wanted to start by just reflecting on the energy of the past 2 days. Many of you have taken the time to share your memories on Instagram, on social media. There's been a wonderful number of comments, and thank you for those. It's been a great pleasure to do this webinar series, and it's really the first time that we've dipped our toe in doing something like this. So any feedback that you have would be most appreciated. But it's also got me to think about a philosophy of the way that sports medicine, sports science works, and also a responsibility that I think that we all have. And this is a slide from Stefano Della Villa, my mentor, from our conference in 2012 in Stamford Bridge. It was our first international conference, and Stefano spoke really about post-surgical management, but his approach was very simple. If you want to achieve, you need to shoot and reach the top. You actually need to not just to talk about getting the top, but you actually need to reach the top. To do that, you need to work as a team. And you really need to communicate to the world. And really, what I've understood in these last 2 days is that there's an energy, there's a network, and there are people there waiting to discuss and share experiences, which will only get us to be better. So if we think about the landscape and the challenges at the moment, I think we all need to ask ourselves the question, when we see this picture, what do we see? For me, I see the summit. For others, I think you see the mountain, but we should all see the challenge of climbing the mountain, or the challenge of working back from the summit. And in terms of that summit, I'm talking about the World Cup in Qatar 2022. The Premier League has already started to draft plans. These aren't official plans, these are just plans that were placed on the BBC website at the end of last year. And what it talks about is really having a start date on the 21st of November 2022. So just over 25 months from now, or just under 25 months from now. Prospectively, the Premier League season may finish on the 12th of November. There will be a rest period, but in effect that rest period would be international team camps. Then the tournament would finish on the 18th of December. And then you have another theoretical rest after the tournament is finished. Normally that's 3 weeks after a summer tournament. And then the Premier League would restart on the 26th of December 2022. So as I said, I'm a person that thinks from the summit. I take the optimism of reaching the summit and I work backwards. And I think that strategy is the way to approach these next 2 years. What we know is we have the World Cup in November 2022. We know before that, we have a summer which at the moment only has one tournament scheduled, and that's the Women's Euro 2022. In the men's game, it's not yet decided, although international managers have already started to talk about potentially that being a point of time for camps or bringing the domestic season back into that. For sure, I think that we can understand that the club versus country discussion will only rage at that point, as teams maybe think about taking their players overseas for pre-season tours. Earlier in 2022, we have the Africa Cup of Nations in Cameroon in January and February, a tournament that's so important for the African players, a tournament that has historically been full of colour, but also for domestic teams is also a time in the season where there is congestion, and there's also fears of potential illness and injury coming from that tournament. We also have the Nations League, the UEFA Nations League finals to complete, which will be scheduled for October 2021, and the relegation in March 2022. And before that, in next summer, we have the Copa America in Argentina and Colombia. We have the Euros being rescheduled from this past summer through June and July next year, which means that the fixtures for qualification for FIFA World Cup 2022 will be pushed to some other part of the calendar. And of course, we have the completion of the domestic and European seasons, culminating with the Champions League on the 29th of May 2021. So what do we know? Well, we know there's a challenge. We also know there's an opportunity to differentiate ourselves, both as individuals, but also as a team. We know that we'll have the shortest World Cup in history. We also know that there are different conditions. Whilst it won't be the heat of the summer in the Middle East, it certainly will be different to the normal conditions that the European-based players, which will be the majority of the players going to the World Cup, will come from. We also know we have a two-part season. We don't know when it will start in 2022, I imagine in August, but we know it will stop. We know it will stop either at the end of October or the beginning of November. Not all of the players from the teams where the domestic season has stopped will go to the World Cup. So we know that we have a challenge of meeting the needs of the physical and mental needs of those players that are proverbially left behind. We also have an uncertain summer 2022, potentially not a time where players maybe will be able to get that rest that otherwise they would have had. We have international congestion in 2021 and 2022 season with the overspill of the qualifications for the World Cup. And we also know that we've got a COVID-19 impacted 2020-21 season that's already started by pushing the season later and also having more midweek games. I genuinely believe that this is our primary goal as a community of football medicine, football science. We need to promise that we are dedicated to having the best players available for the games and that we have more players available to train. I think that's our social, our ethical, our professional responsibility. We also know with COVID that we have a financial responsibility to get players available to play and ideally having the best players available to play, because TV revenues form so much of our industry's revenue, not just at the highest levels of the game, but the way it filters down into our lower professional ranks, semi-professional, and even the amateur game. This is a game that we love and a game that we need to protect. As we discussed over the last couple of days, not all injuries are equal. And I think that so often we talk about the total number of injuries in the squad, but I think we now need to ever more think about the injury burden, things that have more impact, such as the ACL tear or the hamstring muscle injury that has a higher incidence, maybe not necessarily a higher severity. But what we do also know is that re-injury rates could rise, particularly with the congestion and the manager's demands and the owner's demands for players to play. So what we need is a strategy, and we need activities focused for the goal. And what I'm talking about as a goal here is sustainable player availability, not just player availability, but sustainable player availability over a 2-year period. That's the players towards the end of their careers that want to go to that World Cup, a crowning part of their career, or it's the younger players that see it as an aspirational target. So it's sustainable player availability. But what we also know is that whilst we have this strategy, we also need agility to cope with the COVID-19 factor. So what are the complications? This was a nice challenge from Marcus Walden at the conference on the future of football medicine in 2017 in Barcelona. The challenge we gave him was looking at the data of the first 16 years of the UEFA Elite Club Injury Survey. What could we argue is the next 15-year projection for injury incidence? And on the left-hand side, you'll see that in an average player squad of 25, that hip and groin injuries and lateral ankle sprains in particular have predominated. As you see the transition over the next 15 years, and this is a futuristic, this is a prediction that's based upon previous trends and also evidence on a daily basis. But again on this is that we've been successful as a community in reducing the number of hip and groin injuries and prospectively the number of ankle sprains, but we're still challenged by hamstring injuries and still challenged by the severe ACL injuries. As Matt talked about yesterday, hamstring incidence has been on the rise. There is a question whether or not it's now plateauing, and there's a paper in review at the moment from Jan Ekstrand and the Football Research Group that talks to whether or not there is a high but plateaued level of hamstring injuries. We also know that this season already has started with a high number of muscle injuries. I wrote a piece in the Telegraph in July. It's not now to pat myself on the back because it was probably very easy to see, but in the Project Restart, so the domestic seasons coming back in Europe, the injury rates were relatively low. There'd been increased number of substitutions. There'd been some breaks of play, particularly focused on ensuring the hygiene and the safety of the players. But it seemed to me that there was only going to be a 3-week break, and then we were going to go into an international 1, 2, 3 double headers. So last week in The Athletic, they talked about 78 muscle and tendon injuries already in the Premier League. And also we know from COVID has had an impact on society as a whole, but on football in terms of taking away the winter break. Now, this is a winter break in the Premier League that was only introduced for the first time this year. Quite ironic because it was in February, it was over 2 weeks. And then by the middle of March, there was an enforced 2-month break for the players. But that commitment to a winter break has now moved from the Premier League. And I suspect there's also going to be a challenge in Germany, in France, in Spain, and the other European leagues. And this was an area that I had a real, I suppose, my first interest. The first article I ever wrote in the newspaper was around a challenge to say, would a winter break ease injury toll? I'd watched a game between Manchester United and Chelsea. There'd been 3 first half muscle injuries. And I just wondered at that point, did the Premier League have a different approach? Yes, it did. Italy and Spain historically have had 2-week international or winter breaks. France, 3 weeks. And then Germany, and certainly in the 2014 Brazil World Cup campaign, had 6 weeks. Also the question marks over pitch quality, although that's changed with the new Deso pitches, cumulative load, and prospectively also the impact on mental health. It wasn't necessary that players would stop training in this period, but there would just be a lack of competition and obviously an opportunity for them to spend time with families or maybe even time in the sun. So we did a study, and I think it's the first time I've spoken about it, although it was published last year. And this was looking at the leagues of Europe and looking at the significance of a winter break. The hypothesis was that the injury rate would increase without a winter break, and the proportion of players attending training and being available for matches would decrease in the second part of the season. The study itself was for 56 teams, 15 countries over 7 seasons. And what we did was look at injury and availability variables, as described by my colleague at the Football Research Group, Martin Hagland, and particularly focused on incidence of severe injuries. That's the number of severe injuries absence over 28 days per 1,000 hours of exposure, and injury burden, the number of absence days per 1,000 hours of exposure. Also looking at percentage of training attendance and match day availability. And the paper conclusions were that elite football clubs that do not have a winter break have lost more player days to injury than those that do. So 303 days lost to injury in the Premier League relative to the other leagues in Europe. There's a negative effect on injury burden before and after the break, but only the incidence of severe injuries after. No impact on training or match availability, and climate impact on pitches were discussed. But of course, the challenge is, if you have a winter break, do you have lower injury rates? And if you don't have a winter break, do you have higher injury rates? And Robin Thorpe put a challenge out to me, which was really, were there other factors at play? And those other factors are things that we should think about in our daily practice in football. The question is, certainly when we're comparing data, is the competitiveness of the leagues the same? Are refereeing decisions or refereeing approaches different in different leagues? Are the total number of games comparable? Is there an offset in the size or the depth of the squads? Is there more rotation? Changing managers, although actually it seemed that there was no difference in the tenure of managers across the leagues in Europe. Vitamin D levels, particularly in Northern Europe and for players of African descent playing in those conditions. Mental fatigue. And then the big question is, do injuries really matter, certainly from a performance perspective? And in that season, ironically, 4 teams from the Premier League were in the Champions League quarterfinals. So I think it's probably now looking at the challenge ahead that we need to understand what is it in the role between the domestic, the club teams and the national teams. So I've been involved in a recent study with Alan McCall and with FIFA, and this came out of a piece of work that we originally did looking at the World Cups. We looked at the World Cup in 2014 in Brazil, particularly looking at injury prevention strategies. And then we also did that across the female and youth World Cups. What we also understood was that when looking at PubMed, that in professional football, injury studies really sit in the domestic game, not in international football. And when you look at the performance, it's even more startling because you have 161 focused on professional football, but only 9 looking at international football. So what did we do? Well, we looked at implementing an expert-based Delphi study. So a study looking at consensus, building consensus. And we took the medical and fitness physical conditioning departments from the teams from the 2018 World Cup in Russia. We had a series of sequential rounds of questioning and then gave the opportunity for the participants to change or rethink their answers. So until we got a consensus, or it was clear that there was no consensus to be achieved. We considered a consensus when more than 70% of the practitioners agreed, and we focused basically on 4 themes in that transition from the club to the national team and from the national team to the club. Those were what information needs to be collected, why that information needs to be collected and how to use it, what challenges, barriers exist to collecting the information, and how do we collect the information. And there were 3 rounds in total. And in that, you can see from the response rate, there was more in the physical departments as we went further on. So what medical information do we need in the minds of the international teams to collect before? There was the information around injury epidemiology, around medical screening tests, and around treatment strategies. And then from a physical perspective, what information was needed? More information and slightly different information. And that went from fatigue status, training loads, match loads, exercise prevention programs, details on restrictions on normal training, wellness, and fitness levels. And the question is why collect it and how to use it? And fundamentally, the reason to use it is because it's in the best interest of the player. It's in the best interest of the player to individualize any approach to that player. Now, normally, there is a little bit of an arm wrestle between the club and the national team. Sometimes there's game playing, particularly when it comes to the friendlies. But it's in the best interest of the players for communication between the club and the national teams. Of course, there are challenges, and these are the ones that were recognized. On the medical side, everybody recognized that there was communication issues with the club staff. There was a willingness sometimes of the club staff to share. And then the quality and the completeness of the information. There were sometimes holes in the information. On the physical side, again, communication, but maybe a little less issue with the communication and the willingness to share. And again, on the quality and completeness. But also discussions about whether or not there were legal issues of sharing data, particularly across cross borders. If you had a player playing in a Premier League or Bundesliga team that was on national duty in Argentina or Colombia, for example, perhaps there were different legal and data laws around the information that was being passed. And the recurring themes were fundamentally FIFA and the national teams need to communicate. They need to work together. If you ask for information, you have the responsibility to share back information as well. It can't be just a one-way street. I don't think that this is a valid argument, but is also a challenge, which is that foreign language. Communication is not just simply about what we say, it's about how we say it. And sometimes we have to find a way to communicate, even if language is between us. Is there a question on having something designed around the electronic chart? and a standardized method. So these were the recurring themes, both on the medical and the fitness side. So I guess what we've talked about is the complications and challenges in the landscape, particularly looked at congestion, what's coming ahead, probably more communication that's going to be required between the international national teams and the domestic club sides. And what I want to propose to you, not necessarily is what is the solution to all of this, but maybe what are the frameworks that we can look to. This to me is one of the best papers around injury prevention. It really went under the title, are we preparing players to be healthy or are we preparing players to win? It's a nice challenge. It came from Phil Coles in 2017. And I think he reflected a lot on his time coming from Liverpool Football Club and then going into the NBA with San Antonio Spurs. I'd recommend you accessing this paper, and it looks a lot at the different parts of injury prevention and also the culture of the organization that you work within. Within the Football Research Group, and certainly work that I've been involved in the last 3 to 5 years, and really under the leadership of the great Jan Ekstrand, the challenge was, are there other factors that we need to think about in injury prevention, or what we might also now term sustainable player availability? Is there an impact of leadership styles? And I don't think it's just now on the coaches, I also think it's on us as individuals, and certainly the leaders of the medical and performance departments. Load on players, the role of internal communication and well-being. Now, anybody that spends any time with me, doesn't take long for me to talk about the role of communication. And maybe it's easier for me to talk about communication as a non-practitioner, but I fundamentally believe that it is a crucial part to ensuring, one, that high performance culture exists, and secondly, that we have an opportunity to stop injuries happening. This was a paper that we published and is open access on the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and really looks at in communication, not just in quantity, but in quality. And that's communication between coaching staff, players, medical and performance staff, and the really deep importance of sharing and communicating information. And why is it important? I think this is something that we all know, but we should also remind ourselves of. Communication at its best builds relationships. It builds and supports trust and commitment. Too often in elite sport, too often in healthcare, too often in sports sciences, we work in silos. And without communication, there's often not a clear direction, there's often vague goals, and there's no opportunity for improvement. What we need is genuine two-way dialogue. We don't want ambiguous, unfocused communication, lacking those important details. We need precise, we need timely, and we need inclusive communication. And what we looked at in this paper was the interrelationships with the doctors and the physios, the medical team and the coach manager, the medical team and the fitness coaches, the medical team and the club executive, and then a sum of the communications. And in that communication sum, what we understood was that was a 6% increase in training attendance and a 6% match availability where teams had high levels of cumulative communication. What we also understood was that if there was one poor communication link, and that was between the head of the medical or head of the performance and medical department and the manager, it had a disastrous impact on injury and availability. So again, on a training attendance basis, there was a difference of 7%, on a match availability, 6%. And interestingly enough, when it came to severe injuries, there was a 50% higher level of severe injury where there was a poor relationship and poor communication channel between the manager and the head of the medical or performance department. So the conclusions of that paper maybe are relatively easy to think about and relatively simple. But if you have good internal communication, this could be an elite football club, it can be in your private practice, it can be in your household. It has a positive impact. So you have less injuries in an elite football, and we're talking about Champions League teams here, and you have a higher player availability compared to the teams with less communication. And if that communication between the head coach and the manager is poor, then that has a detrimental impact on the overall injury situation, injury burden, and level of severe injuries within a team. And I guess what I'm going to leave you on as a paper is leadership. And this was a paper, again, from the Football Research Group, accessing the data from the Champions League injury survey. And I think if you look to the wall and you look to Jan Ekstrand and his colleague from a Qatari club team, those, and we can take coaches out of the, although coaches we know have an impact, but if we just replace the word of coach, and you can replace it with what you want to replace it, those that foster trust, involvement and cooperation, give encouragement and recognition to staff members, have less injuries and improved performance in teams, exclamation mark. So yes, it's good sense, but also we've been able to find now in the data a real sense that inclusive, democratic, and communicative leadership has an impact on sustainable player availability. So for me, the take-home messages are simple. Have a strategy for the next 2 years. Don't wake up in 6 months or 12 months' time and think, oh, this is going to be a difficult 2-year period. Not just COVID, but COVID obviously has a compounding impact. I think we have to accept that injuries are inevitable in this period. The exposure rates are just too high for them not to be there. And football medicine and football science has a responsibility to lead. That doesn't mean that we have to take total responsibility, but we have a responsibility to lead. We have to be proactive. This is time for proactivity in football medicine and football science. If we listen to the words of Marcus Walden and his predictions over the next 15-year period, we think about what Matthew and what Francesco said to us in the last couple of days, we have things that we need to focus on, and we need risk mitigation strategies. Injury prevention, I think, is a difficult word for us to consume, but injury risk mitigation and the strategies there, and also around illness in this period, COVID, influenza, potentially malaria for any of our players playing in the African Cup of Nations. And think about the high impact ACL, hamstring. Think about looking at where those weaknesses are and doing something about them. And don't forget, and this was the topic of our conference, player voices. The player's voice is so important. They are human. They have worries and anxieties, but they also know their body and they know what is possible. So listen to the players' voices. And just finally, and this goes back maybe to the start of the presentation, and one of my reflections is think about that summit. Think about reaching the top. Have a strategy to do that, but understand that it only comes through teamwork. It can't be on any individual shoulders solely. And take the opportunity to communicate internationally. What we know from COVID is that we have that greater opportunity through technology, through familiarization, and know that that network is there to help you. You're not alone. We're here as a team, and let's reach the top of the FIFA World Cup in 2022 with as many of our best players available to play. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. That was fantastic. So for anyone who has questions, if you want to add them into the Q&A box, Mike, we've already got one that's come in. and I believe it's related to the schedule that you presented for the World Cup 2022. Is it that the Premier League is scheduled kind of their traditional Boxing Day games, which would essentially mean athletes coming back from the World Cup having 1 week and then playing some of those traditional holiday fixtures?
It's difficult to know. I think it's just a coincidence of the timing of when the World Cup will finish, I think, on the 18th of December or around that period on Qatar National Day. I think the idea was to give a just over 1 week break. Obviously, not all of the players would necessarily be competing in the tournament until that point. For sure, anybody that knows the TV schedule in the Premier League, and it's the same, and you know the same in the NBA, because they're talking about bringing back the NBA just before Christmas. There's no doubt that TV revenue and also people sat at home as family units being able to tune in is important. I think this is, as I say, it's important to know that that's unpublished. It's still, I don't know the details, but I think it's still very much in discussion. But it's obviously very different to the normal summer where players would get somewhere between 3 to 4 weeks. Of course, teams can choose to pull players back later. And I remember Sir Alex Ferguson used to have a strong tactic, which was to take the players that had played at the World Cup or the European Championships. Remember, this time we're playing European Championships less than 18 months before the World Cup. Normally it's at least 24 months. And he used to give them the first 2 weeks of the season off. Or if he was going to play them, he'd say, I'll find an injury for you in December, January, and you can put your feet up and watch the Boxing Day TV.
Just to kind of tag on to that, thinking about where we are right now in relation to, say, what's coming up this summer with Copa America and the Euro. You know, here in the States as well as in Europe, we're starting to see COVID numbers come back up. What are your thoughts for strategies both on the club side as well as the international side for trying to deal with that, but also in anticipation looking forward to what's coming up this summer?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had now, in September, we had 2 games, and then we had 2 games in October, and we've got another one coming up in November. So we've got this series of, in Europe, Nation League fixtures. There was meant to be a friendly between New Zealand and England, which got cancelled. I think it fundamentally goes back to trust and communication. I think that the national teams know their responsibility. The players now also know that it's unacceptable behaviorally to break the bio bubbles. So obviously we had an instance in England of 2 younger players in Iceland finding that off the field distractions were too tempting, but it came down very quickly that in some ways this is behavioral. I think you'll know, Amy, from your own experience in the bubble in Disney, that there's an element of push and pull on these things. Some of them you need to pull people along with you, and sometimes you have to push people. I think what it probably means is that there are going to be, when you're in camp, there are less distractions and maybe more time to focus on just the kind of training and maybe even time to do any of the injury risk mitigation. But there's no doubt that also I think that people are going to be fearful of travel. I think that people have probably got, or players and staff have got their heads around traveling within Europe, but whether or not that then translates to traveling further afield, But we're also talking about a very unique group of people that have not quite unlimited resources, but a lot more resources than the normal population.
Right, absolutely. Kind of following on the theme of trust. In the case of, we talked about the coach and medical director relationship being really important. What are some thoughts or recommendations that you have on improving that relationship in the case where it might not be the strongest or the most functional?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it change in the last 5 years, and it'd be interesting to see if we did that study again in 2 to 3 years' time. I think there's obviously a lot of the time people are fearful of hierarchy. And I think that if you boil it down to fundamentally what is in the best interests of the manager, well, in the best interest of the manager is sustainable player availability, or players available that he wants to be available for, or she wants them to be available for a particular game. And I think that there's a need really to be direct about it. Sometimes the medical community doesn't speak the same language, and that's not necessarily whether or not it's English, French, Spanish. It's the language that is relevant for the head coach or the manager. And also, no surprises. My experience tells me that the thing that managers, head coaches hate are surprises. The number of times I've seen, and it goes back to the study, which is with higher player availability, you have higher performance. So for the coach, I think the coach knows this. I think sometimes it's important to show them the evidence that it's there, show them maybe even show them that communication and leadership style prospectively has a negative impact. Whether or not they'll change their stripes is a different matter. But I think that being ahead, even if it's bad news, I think sometimes we find it hard to deliver bad news, but it's better to deliver bad news early and don't necessarily talk about time, because I think time is also one of those things where we've used as an industry. It'll be 2 weeks. And then 10 days come along, it's like, sorry, gaffer, but it's going to be another 2 weeks. And that's just the worst thing. And I think also you have to know when you can get time individually, one-on-one at a human level. I mean, you and I probably will remember, if you wanted to speak to Kenny Atkinson, try and get him at 6 or 6:30 in the morning as he's on his exercise bike. Find an individual strategy, be proactive, and don't be afraid of what is deemed to be negative information. So I always say there are only friendly facts in life.
That's good. I think you've actually within that answered Nicholas's question. So the next one is, what is the best strategy to accommodate the players to Qatar weather, knowing that many of the players may be coming from cold weather areas?
I mean, I think if we look at the data, we're talking probably what we know is it'll be very, very dry. We know it's not going to rain. We also know that it's probably in the range of 22 to 24 degrees Celsius. So what you would call slightly, not quite temperate, but certainly not hot. Humidity is less. We don't know enough about the technology in the stadiums around the temperature control and humidity piece of it. I think the adaptation will be relatively quick. I think it won't, I think that in some ways, the national teams will have to find training bases as close to Qatar, if not within Qatar, and get their players there. Of course, probably the biggest issue is going to be around illness, just moving between the two seasons. I think for the players and the staff, it will just be delightful to have the sun on the back of their necks and I think from an adaptation perspective, I don't think it's going to be hot enough that, certainly if, I remember doing an article about England's first game in Manaus in the 2014 World Cup. And that was looking at 92% humidity and something around, and it was 5 or 6 p.m. kickoff, but it was still 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. So, there was a wall of heat. I think it's going to be more like the conditions of late August, early September.
Another question that we have is, what do you think, because of the pandemic and scheduled disturbances, as well as disturbances in kind of training rhythm, do you think the sports medicine community can provide some sort of prevention program, maybe like the 11 plus, to help keep individual players available?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty at the elite level is the individualized approach that's needed. It's one of those ones where, and we know now, if you look at some of the, you may have a player that's 40 years old, a goalkeeper that's 40 years old, and then you may have a 16-year-old that's just coming into the game. They have different levels of miles on the clock. They have different, preparations themselves. They know their bodies best. I think what there is probably just a need to recognize, and I think it goes back to, I'm sorry, it's a vague answer, but it's having a strategy, but it's a co-ownership strategy. So you've got ultimately national team players. Most of the players in the high level leagues will play in the national team, or they'll be there or thereabouts. And then you've got the clubs, and then you've got all of the other stakeholders around the players. But ultimately, you've got the player, and the player is the most consistent in all of this. So I think the best strategy really is a lot more of listening to the player's voice. I'm going to be a bit of a broken record on that, but I think that when I talk about communication, I'm not just talking about me talking, I'm talking about me listening, or I'm talking about, and that's not just listening to wait for the moment for me to talk, that's me listening to pick up something that's important for me to help support.
I definitely agree. I think the listening part is absolutely crucial. We've got another question that's more on the medical side, which is players who are infected by COVID, can they return to football without any side effects in the short term or the long term?
I think Francesco might have to help me on this one.
Let's actually bring Matt and Francesco in, because we've also got some hamstring questions waiting to get answered as well.
Good. I will take care about the COVID one. Matt will take care about that. So no, this is a very good question. So thank you. Well, there are some ongoing studies, so I cannot answer you fully to your question. We have had many examples of also champions that came back after COVID, but for sure we need to evaluate the early, mid, and long-term consequences in a prospective manner with a very large sample size. And this is what the FIFA is doing. This is what, as FIFA Medical Center of Excellence group all around the world, we are doing, coordinated by Andy Massey and some other key stakeholders about general health aspects after internal medicine disorders like COVID is. And so we need to wait the results of these prospective studies. So I suggest you to just stay tuned on all the FIFA channels, on all the FIFA socials, because we are gonna study this. So we are in the process of studying. And personally, I produced some with a colleague from all around the world, some of the documents to create a basement for this kind of study planification. And then there is a group that is in charge of doing this study. So this is my answer. Definitely, probably by a medical point of view, it depends by the extent of the disease. So not just in terms of symptoms, but how much the virus have created really a problem through this inflammatory response to the organs. So there may be some players with bigger problems than others. Generally, what we see every day are not big problems, but basically we don't know.
Thanks, Francesco. The next one, I think Matt and Mike might both be able to join in on. Question refers to hamstring injuries. Is there an association with weather conditions? And do more hamstrings happen in colder or warmer conditions?
You want me to take that one, Mike? So, to be honest, I'm not aware of strong research showing that there is an influence. I think Martin Hangland did a study on weather conditions and injuries, but I'm not sure that was specifically looking at hamstrings. What I do know is a lot of the research generally looks at the influence of temperature on muscle function. So there's some studies looking at the influence of a warm-up or the influence of temperature on rate of force development, power, strength. And it's known that rate of force development is influenced a lot by muscle temperature. And so theoretically, you would expect warmer temperatures to be better for the hamstring function than colder temperatures. But I think when it comes to weather, a lot of players are doing generally pretty good warm-ups. Most players don't enter a match cold as such. And one of the issues with a lot of the research is they will compare, cold temperatures versus warm temperatures. And physiologically, there's such a huge difference that in practice, it doesn't really, I think, have that much of an impact. I would expect after a good warm-up for temperature not to play a huge role, in that hamstrings are so complex that the climate is unlikely to have a massive impact. I think it's more your prevention strategies, your load management than the weather. And yeah, nothing more to add. I don't know if Mike has something to add around that climate paper.
No, it wasn't specific enough on injuries. There was a little bit of reference to ACLs, because there's always been a discussion about pitch hardness, even though now with pitch hardness and the deso pitches and the drainage in the kind of northern part of Europe, I'm not sure that necessarily is the case. I mean, what I would say, again, this goes back to a similar kind of thing. I think that often hamstrings can be a dysfunction. They can be symptomatic of a dysfunction in communication. So I think sometimes it's, as your model talked about yesterday, it's so multifactorial that I think to just pinpoint something like climate would be too simplistic. Amy, I don't know. I mean, you obviously are now in a game that's in a controlled temperature environment, an arena environment. Have you ever seen anything around hamstring injuries in basketball?
No, and unfortunately, that's one of the things about basketball is there's so little published literature that it's hard to really dig into much at all. So no, not related to basketball. I haven't. Although one of the things we do deal with in basketball is a very congested schedule. So the last question we've got currently in the Q&A box is, what do you suggest about the schedule of matches now after the start of the season and the rate at which players are getting injured? Hence, is there a need to allow for 5 substitutions?
So, I mean, I think that, again, the 5, just so people know what happened with the 5 substitutions. So there's an ability now and that's still in place, where you can make 3 different substitutions, or you can make substitutions at 3 different points in the match. That could be 3 and then 1 and then 1, or it could be I don't think you can put all 5 on at once. I think that, you know, and this is where it's going to be really a discussion internally at each of the club, is what is the expectation of this season for that club? And then understanding, you know, what that expectation is. And normally the top teams are having to compete on 4 different levels. So they're competing for the Champions League, they're competing for the domestic title, they're competing for a domestic cup, and sometimes they're even competing for a Super Cup or something like that. And I think it depends on really the incentivization sometimes of the manager in the team. The manager will lose their job on a series of poor results. So often their incentivization is for short-term gain. Particularly also now with ownership and TV money, and also money from winning competitive tournaments, there's also a kind of, and at the time that they don't have game day revenue or they don't have season ticket revenue, there may be a little bit more short-termism there. So at that point, really, it's going back to kind of the player. I know Kevin De Bruyne was quite outspoken in the last couple of weeks about, well, you sent me to go and play at Belgium before I could even play the first game. You know, I pulled up. I could have told you that. I think there's, you know, probably those discussions need to be in private rather than public, but I think there just needs to be, you know, more openness of communication.
In the chat box, Mark Spalding has just helped us out in saying that hamstrings relative risk 0.97, so a non-significant difference between warm and cold climate zones in Europe. So thank you so much, Marcus, for helping us out there. So anyone who's got questions for all 3 of our panelists, please add them in. I'm gonna put one into all 3 of you that kind of joins all 3 of your talks together, and that's taking what we know in the literature and what comes out on a regular basis in our journals with the top level evidence. How do we better translate that into practice, or more quickly translate what comes out in the literature into practice?
I can take the question for first. So just 2 simple pieces of advice. First of all, as a health practitioner, so we are doctors, we are physios, we are sports scientists, we are what we are on the side of health of the player. So first of all, what we need to do is try to sustain the health of the player. So in the health, so injury, performance trade-off, equilibrium, we are on the health side. This is number 1. Number 2, if you have a patient, so we see as practitioner patients with ACL injuries, patient with other knee injuries, so we take care of rehabilitation in the day by day. All what you do is the same. You do for your patient. And so if you think that this patient needs additional 2 months of rehab because objectively is not good enough, as a 25% quad deficit, as a very bad dynamic frontal plane alignments, as a very weak hamstring, or whatever you find, just fight for your patient. So fight for the health of the player and fight for your patient to really recover after injury. It's up to you. So it's up to us. It's not a problem of the coach or the player himself. We can be proactive, and then sometimes we are successful and sometimes not. But this is part of life. What we can do is modify what we do, so our approach.
Cool. I'll just add a little bit to what Francesco said. in terms of, I think, for me, what we do in practice is often a lot more complex than is maybe indicated in the literature. And I think there is a bit of a disconnect between research and practice. And I think in order to get stuff published a lot of the time, there's such a huge focus on having controlled and well-defined research, but actually in an applied setting, it's a lot more complex. And it's sometimes very, very hard to detail why we do what we do in practice. And I think the need, that's why I kind of draw on the sort of the hamstring approach, is I think there is a need to get the opinions of practitioners on what they do, why they do it, and trying to align their experiences with the literature, recognizing that often there is this disconnect between what is published and what is actually needed to be done. And in terms of what Francesco said there, you know, our ACL rehab approach at Isokinetic is quite complex, has a lot of components. Some of them are not heavily researched. We are having to look around the literature and make some assumptions from certain studies, and often recognize that some of the stuff we're talking about might not be there for 10 years, but we're not going to hold off and wait for the evidence. We're going to try to be ahead of what's available, recognizing that just because it's not yet evidence-based doesn't mean it's not something we should do as practitioners. As long as we think it makes sense, there's good theory, there's good anecdotal experience, you know, we can't just wait for researchers to show us what to do, because often it's too complex to do the research to demonstrate the efficacy of our programs. And I think that's where kind of translation of research into practice is really important. Engaging researchers and practitioners, and sometimes recognizing that there's going to be a bit of a gap. Maybe that's where anecdotal experience can come in, and that is sometimes the best available evidence. And I think any young practitioners out there, yes, you do need to be evidence-based in terms of you need to respect what evidence is available, but you do need to develop your experiences and recognize your experiences can be really valuable, and don't kind of read a paper and if it conflicts with your experience, then you need to combine both of them and make these links with your experience and with the literature as well.
Awesome, thank you. We've got one for Francesco. So as we saw in your presentation, ACL injuries are less likely to occur when the fatigue is high and the players are tired. Additionally, this person cannot remember ACL injuries in competitions like the World Cup. So is it because high fatigue and the exhausting schedule or less intensity from the players? Is there any literature to support that?
Yeah, long question, but interesting, because this is really a hot topic: fatigue and ACL injuries. I like the topic. But I like to be provocative. So I agree with you. So there is a certain role of a congested match schedule that create fatigue. So maybe less intensity and maybe less ACL injury. This is absolutely logical. I don't have any data to support this. I'm not aware about all the studies that have been published. Maybe there is something, but I'm not sure. What I can tell you again is that ACL injuries across multiple sports happens in the first part of the match, not in the latest, more frequently. So it is possible to have an ACL injury at the end of the match, but if you take large numbers, you will see that around 60–65% will happen in the first half and around 70% in the first 45 minutes of gameplay, corrected for substitutions. So for us, and we spoke many times about this finding with Matthew, because we tried really to give the most balanced answer in the discussion in our paper, is that the intensity is higher at the beginning. So in terms of World Cup matches and the national team matches, there weren't a lot of injuries happening actually in our study and also in other studies that we are doing now. But this is because of the exposures. So you cannot compare the number of exposures of the World Cup, of a national team matches with the general European leagues and maybe Champions League matches, if you add all of them. So it's normal to see less injuries. At the best of my knowledge, no one has tried to really compare the incidence of ACL in World Cup or national team matches and European matches. But please, someone can correct me if I'm wrong.
Or somebody can pick that up as a study.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, ideas, you know, Amy, it's all about ideas regarding studies.
Maybe Marcus will help us out with that as well.
Yeah, probably.
We've got one last question that hasn't been asked so far in the Q&A box. When is the best time for a player to go back to regular training after COVID-19 myocarditis? Are there any new recommendations?
So, okay. After myocarditis, okay. So, as an Italian sports medicine physician, we are trained mainly for sports cardiology. So to do this preventative consultation that every sports athlete in Italy has to do once a year. So I had some experience during my training, during my specialization, but this is not my field. However, there are some evidence-based practical recommendations to return to play following myocarditis. So I strongly suggest an evaluation with a sport cardiologist, whatever myocarditis is, COVID-19 or another viral myocarditis is the same. And then if the sport cardiologist at the ultrasound or at the stress EKG find something strange, maybe the athlete is eligible for a cardiac MRI in order to evaluate if there is any scar tissue, because the scar tissue may be dangerous in terms of trigger for electric pathology like fibrillation. But this is not my field. I strongly suggest an evaluation with sports cardiologist and cardiac ultrasound plus stress EKG. If the sports cardiologist say that you have to do also an MRI to check for scar tissue, do also an MRI. So we cannot joke with myocarditis. Myocarditis is a possible cause of sudden cardiac death. So no joke, myocarditis is not an ACL, it's 1,000 times worse.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we've had submitted so far.
Great.
So,
well, just looking at the time, I think it's perfect timing for us to end. So, Amy, thank you for guest starring today. It shows us again the connections across the world, and my answer to the question around translating research into practice is about bravery and courage to actually do, but also utilizing and building networks to make sure that you don't try and do it yourself. And the one thing that I've learned in my life is that I'm so much better by the people that I'm connected to. And also that if you challenge yourself to ask questions and to listen, then you'll be a better researcher and you'll also be a better practitioner, or maybe someone like you, somewhere between the two. So Matt, Francesco, it's been fun. I think we need to do it again. I'm not sure when, but we definitely, I feel like a late night TV host. I know that I'll miss this tomorrow. And certainly with the chat box, seeing the little messages and seeing the, hey, I'm here from Turkey, or I'm here from Lebanon, don't underestimate the energy that that gives to us as well. So I want to wish you all a very safe Monday and the rest of the week, and stay in touch with us, and we'll keep you updated about the upcoming conference. Thank you again.
Thank you.